Tonight on The Readout,
we have a duty to get into these agencies and look at how they have been weaponized to go against the very people they are supposed to represent, how they've infringed on First Amendment liberties of the American people, and we're going to do that.
investigating the investigators. House Republicans are getting ready to take a sledgehammer to yet another American institution with the false narrative that the DOJ is unfairly targeting the right. Also tonight, Republicans learned nothing from the election. The new House majority is actively working to take away what's left of women's reproductive rights, voting on 2 abortion-related measures today. And hard to believe it, but George Santos lied about being a star volleyball player at the college he lied about attending. That as New York Republicans call for his resignation. But Kevin McCarthy decided today to reward Congressman Catch Me If You Can instead. And we begin tonight with a noteworthy example of how the FBI can go wrong. Back in the 1960s, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. criticized the FBI, then under J. Edgar Hoover, for failing to enforce civil rights, particularly in the South. Hoover denounced the critique by calling King the most notorious liar in the country. King's public criticism made him a target for Hoover, who singled out the civil rights leader for surveillance and defamation. Under the guise of national security, the FBI began investigating King for alleged communist connections, wiretapping King's home, offices, and hotel rooms. The surveillance failed to find evidence of communist ties and looked instead into King's private life. In 1964, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act. Later that year, King would be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his nonviolent campaign against racism. Hoover stepped up his malicious effort, all of which culminated in a now infamous letter and blackmail package sent to King's wife, Coretta Scott King. Here's the letter, typewritten, anonymous. The word evil is used 6 times, calling the recipient King a colossal fraud. It repeatedly condemned King, saying to him, "You are done, and there is only one thing left for you to do," the letter read. "You know what it is. You have just 34 days. Sam Pollard's 2020 documentary, MLK FBI, explores how King and others interpreted that letter.
They put this package together and send it off, saying, "King, you know what you have to do," and giving him a deadline by which he needs to do it. Many people have interpreted that to be that you need to kill yourself, and this is one of the ways that King and his confidants who saw this letter interpreted it.
Years later, a Senate committee would confirm King's suspicion that the FBI attempted to blackmail him, presumably to commit suicide. Which brings us to the here and now. The new House Republican majority is now co-opting a real piece of history, that the FBI is capable of unleashing harassment campaigns, as they did to Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, but saying that this type of harassment is now happening to them. See, look, the FBI is raiding Trump's Mar-a-Lago to confiscate classified material that could only be federal overreach by the Bureau and the Department of Justice, they say. Ditto on the DOJ investigating Trump for inciting an insurrection in which 5 people died, including cops. Political weaponization of the Justice Department, they say. Who was it again who tried to use the DOJ to overturn the 2020 election? Thinking. But of course, it doesn't count when it's Trump, which is why House Republicans, under Trump's My Kevin, are now obsessed with investigating the investigators, voting to establish a new special panel to probe what Republicans call the weaponization of the federal government. So what does weaponization of the federal government mean exactly? Oh, right, Republicans using their mustache-twirling powers to try to end probes into conservatives, which is why Congressman Adam Schiff called this out for what it really is.
What it's really intended to do is to undermine the legitimate investigation of President Trump's incitement of a violent attack on this building, on this Capitol, on this citadel of democracy, an investigation that implicates some of the very members of this body who want to sit on that committee.
This isn't about weaponization. It's about political whining. This is nowhere near what really happened to civil rights leaders in the 60s, when baseless red baiting devastated black organizations, when federal investigators accused an entire movement of being communist and tried to blackmail a Nobel Prize-winning icon to end his life. And yet still, today's Republicans are claiming victimhood status that isn't really for them to undercut legitimate probes on a former president who stole classified documents and incited a mob to overthrow the government. It's the aggressors playing the victim, otherwise known as gaslighting. Joining me now is Jason Johnson, professor of journalism and politics at Morgan State University, MSNBC contributor and host of A Word with Jason Johnson, the podcast known as A Word with Jason Johnson, and former Republican Congressman Francis Rooney of Florida. Thank you both for being here. Jason, I am going to start with you because there is a lot of whining and what I would consider co-opting of real history on the part of Republicans. Your thoughts, Professor?
This is not new to me, Joy. If I were to count the number of white conservatives and Republicans that quote Martin Luther King and claim they marched with him, you would think there was no black people in the crowd. Because I swear every white conservative apparently was an African-American studies major with the way that they cite Martin Luther King and talk about him and his life and everything else like that, despite the fact that all of their policies are the antithesis of what King stood for. Look, this is all nonsense, right? This committee is a bad idea. The idea of the weaponization of the government. Republicans have consistently shown that they have no shame and that weaponization only matters when the government is investigating their own bad behavior. Here's the thing. It's not just the committee is bad. It's not just that it's going to be led by Jim Jordan. And I am sorry, in the name of the Ohio State Buckeyes wrestling team, I cannot fathom the idea of anybody saying that Jim Jordan should be in charge of an investigation. But beyond that, it's the idea that they will have access to all sorts of classified information that they could be funneling to Trump, that they could be funneling to insurrectionists. So it's not just the committee itself as a sham, but it's a way for them to get information from the House Intelligence Committee, which they will use to further the long-term coup. That is the real danger of this, above and beyond the continued abuse and attempt to co-opt the legacy of Martin Luther King.
Let's play Jim Jordan. Here's a little bit of him. And again, I think to remind y'all, you're right. This is somebody who was allegedly implicated in crimes that were committed by the coach he worked for against children. And he's someone who who participated in the insurrection. Just want to set that up for you. Here's Jim Jordan.
Yes.
They went after us today on the floor. They said this is political and we're going to fight it tooth and nail. Why? We're protecting the First Amendment. We're protecting the American people. Why would you fight a Democrat? I thought you guys embraced the Constitution like we all do. Love the First Amendment and the rights we enjoy. That's what this is about. And we're going to do everything we can to protect American citizens' First Amendment liberties.
Former Congressman Rooney, I'm going to bring you in here. I thought you guys embraced the Constitution like we all do. This is somebody who participated in Donald Trump's attempts to overthrow the government. Love the First Amendment and the rights that we enjoy. This is the party that's telling people what they can and cannot read and saying they're not to talk about gay people's existence. Protect the American citizens' rights, First Amendment liberties. This is literally about protecting Donald Trump and maybe about protecting Jim Jordan and other members of Congress and receiving information, demanding information from the DOJ that might be investigating them. Your thoughts?
Well, there's a couple of things I'd like to say here, Joy. I think, first of all, the Republicans are at great peril to minimize January 6th and the impact of it.
Yeah.
And I don't think any rational human being can argue that Trump had a role. Maybe not up to the level of a legal role, but it wouldn't have happened had there never been a Trump. No one would have ever done anything like this if there had not been a Trump. So it may not be the proximate cause that the legal test requires, but it's a serious problem. So I think the Republicans are at a bit of a peril by not embracing it, as Liz and Adam did. And actually, I think the Republicans made a big mistake by not getting on that committee when Speaker Pelosi offered them some seats. Now, on the other hand, nothing's always perfect. The FBI's got its spots. You mentioned some of them, horrible. Okay. I think that a couple of years ago during the Steele memo, Strzok and his girlfriend were a little out of parameter, a little personal, a little political. And I think Director McCabe said that and pushed him back. You know, nobody's perfect. They're all human. But at the end of the day, that's the Department of Justice that we have. That's the protector of and enforcer of our laws. And I think Merrick Garland's just as honorable a guy as anybody else. I don't think attacking him personally is going to get the Republicans anywhere.
Well, let me ask you this, because I think one of the big risks here is that the people on this committee, including Jim Jordan, could begin to demand, there's a separation of powers question here, to demand that the Justice Department turn over information that could involve investigations of members of Congress in order to protect themselves. This feels like the cover-up after the crime.
Yeah, I think there's a principle out there that the Justice Department nor the SEC has to turn over documents in an open investigation. So I think they could probably stop that in court.
Well, let me ask you this question, Jason, because, you know, this is why I'm not in politics.
Jason might know better than me. He's the law professor.
well, listen, I'm petty. So, look, I can't be in Congress. I'm petty. Because if Jim Jordan sent me a subpoena, I might say, when you answer yours, I'll answer that one. You know? So, I mean, in your mind, just from a political standpoint, how should Democrats respond to this?
Oh, leave them on red. Right? Leave him on read. Like, I wouldn't respond to any of this. It's absolute nonsense. Hakeem Jeffries may decide that he wants to put certain people on the committee, but you notice that McCarthy has already said he won't give a committee spot to Raskin. He's afraid of Eric Swalwell. He's afraid of Ilhan Omar. I mean, the whole thing is basically trying to make a cool kids table with a bunch of nerds, right? And that's what they're trying to do. They want to make this committee this cool table, but you're not going to get national attention. You're not going to get 24 hours of coverage. You know why? Because you're not investigating anything that matters. I promise you. Whether it's somebody in the Midwest, New York City, the South, or Geek Squad at Best Buy, nobody cares about Hunter Biden's laptop. And that's the kind of thing that they're going to want to investigate on a regular basis. So I think Democrats should ignore this committee, ignore the sort of corrupt and questionable people who are responsible for it, and focus on making sure they cannot get House intelligence information, because we know these things tend to magically show up in the hands of MAGA members, Republicans, and it might show up in some sort of back closet Mar-a-Lago if we're not careful.
And on the OANN, let me play Representative Byron Donalds last night, because I thought what he said was quite an honest admission that this is about revenge.
What we told Democrat leadership when they went down this pathway of removing members from committee is basically saying you should not do that, because if it's good for the goose, it's good for the gander. We were very clear in the 117th Congress. We should not be going down this pathway of saying, oh, that member said this, they got to be kicked off of committees.
But that is happening.
No.
It is?
What we're doing is, so you did it,
so
now this is what happens, this is the response. Let's get back to the status quo of you pick your committee people, we'll pick ours, and we'll go from there.
Right, and it's obviously not that. I mean, this is a party, Congressman, that is going after the IRS and has been mad at the IRS since the Obama era because they got a flood of people creating 501c3s and they dared to investigate it. And by the way, they investigated progressive ones too, but that doesn't matter. Then you've got the chairman of the House Oversight Committee calling Ukraine an adversary. The only reason you could possibly do that is because Ukraine defied Trump. It feels like the whole party is still trying to serve two purposes: vengeance and Trump. And I wonder what you make of that as a former Republican member of Congress.
Well, I think there's a fair bit of the Trump stuff in there, and it sounds that they're a little bit vengeful. That's not a good tone to use as a senior legislator. They should be a little more politic about it. And what Jason said about not being on the committee, I'm not sure I would agree with that, but what you said does show how corroded our system is in the last 30 or 40 years. Because there was an analogy made to the Church Commission, which I worked on, with Howard Baker. And that was a commission where Frank Church wanted to kill off the CIA. So what's Jordan want to kill off the DOJ or something? I don't know. But the Church Commission had Democrats and Republicans. Howard Baker had a full seat at the table. And when Bill Colby was interviewed, I was sitting right there with him. And it was fair on both sides. And the American people got to hear both sides. If they want to do that kind of process, I think the Democrats ought to get on that committee and play ball.
I guarantee you, if they wanted to have a genuine commission to look at the FBI and go from the rooter to the tutor all the way back, you know, there are a lot of Black Lives Matter organizations that felt like, you know, they were being watched. Anti-war organizations felt they were being watched during the, you know, the early aughts. You would get Democrats on there in a heartbeat, because lots of folks, including a lot of civil rights people, have been saying, yeah, there's issues, but these aren't the issues. Anyway, Jason Johnson and former Congressman Francis Rooney, more proof that the nerd table is the cool kids table. So thank y'all both very much.